Hi, I'm here with Jeffrey Palmer. Jeffrey is an assistant professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, and he's an alumni of the University of Oklahoma, where he picked up his BA and his master's. Jeff, how are you?
Good.
Thanks for coming.
How you doing?
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
All right, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself than the little that I offered up?
Yeah, so I got my BA here at the University of Oklahoma in anthropology, and focused mainly on cultural anthropology, and I did that because my father was a professor in that department.
Is a professor.
Is a professor still. I know,
Yeah.
I shouldn't say he was.
Yeah, he's still
You
trucking.
get mad at me about that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where sort of the seeds of becoming a filmmaker began. I started looking at ethnographic films a lot, and trying to sort of decide within that field what I wanted to do. And so I began looking theoretically at film in that particular period of my studies.
What was that period? You talked about ethnographic film. What time were you looking at?
Probably 1960s, late 1960s,
Right.
Like Rouge, looking a lot at cinema verite and what he was doing. And so, yeah, that was kind of the prime period that I was focusing on. So it was interesting because, what I was seeing at that time, it seemed a lot like exploitation, especially when it came to indigenous subjects.
Right, right.
So I really sort of started to develop this idea of how, as an indigenous person, I wanted to approach filmmaking.
Right.
But at that time, it was very theoretical. It wasn't practice. It wasn't, I was interested in it, but I didn't know how to do it. I was like, and we didn't have filmmakers here in the anthropology department at that time, so there was no one here to train me in that. But it was sort of the beginning that sort of started this fire within me, I guess.
I'm always interested when I find or hear about Native folks heading into anthropology, especially knowing as we do what Vine Deloria had to say about the kind of troubled history. You kind of set them. What was his old joke? The old story about what comprises a typical Native American family, and it's like a mom, a dad, 2 kids, and an anthropologist.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, what brought you to the field, and then heading into it, what sorts of problems did you maybe encounter?
I think I came into the field naive, I mean, I knew what my father was doing with linguistics, and that seemed a little bit outside of the mold of what sort of the 4 areas of anthro were, at that time. And so when I went in, I think, growing up in Norman and sort of growing up in this very sort of middle-class family, and I spent many years in Carnegie, Oklahoma, around my relatives there who were Kiowa, but moved to Norman, at a right around adolescent, age. And so at that time going in, I didn't have this reconnection with Kiowa people at that time, because I just wasn't around them. And so I went, when I got into the field, I think I was pretty naive. And once I started delving into the material, I started to realize, wow, there's just a lot of exploitation that's happening here. There's a lot of things that I was seeing in terms of Native people that was just, not necessarily right in every aspect.
Could I ask you to elaborate? When we say exploitation, I'm not sure that everyone or even we know exactly what we mean by that. What seemed to you exploitative about those early films?
I think it just, being showing ceremonies,
Right. Okay.
showing ceremonial aspects of culture. It didn't seem like the indigenous people that were involved were participants. They
or
were
being served by the films?
Right.
Okay.
Being gazed upon.
I see. Okay.
I almost felt like I was being sort of invited into a world that, it was something that they weren't necessarily, wanting to invite me into.
Right. Okay.
So it was very cold, I think, and the participation was was very low. I mean, it seemed as though they were just, there was an apparatus there and they were performing in front of this apparatus.
Okay.
And so that was essentially what I was seeing in terms of exploitation
Gotcha.
at the time.
Okay, very good. And so then you started making films.
Yeah.
And went a different direction.
Yeah. When I was working on my master's degree here in Native American Studies, I began to, still sort of working theoretically with film, but I began to explore, what I could do on my own, and bought a video camera, and it was a cheap video camera, mini DV camera, and once I figured out how to change the frame rate and could actually shoot something that looked relatively like film, I think that changed everything for me. But I wanted to focus on Native issues, social issues, concerns, and so those early films were particularly just sort of standard documentaries. And so that sort of began that artistic side of me, and the passion sort of developed to become a filmmaker. But I still was sort of housed in this very academic and theoretical world as well, and that's when I wrote my thesis on James Young Deer, and sort of focused on history and film studies of early cinema. And
let me interrupt you. I'm sorry. Young Deer's a fascinating guy. Could you give us a quick rundown of who he was?
He was a Winnebago or Ho-Chunk filmmaker, and started working with different early cinema film companies. And at that time, they didn't have the Hollywood system.
Right.
So there were just these rogue film companies all over the place.
Pathé was his?
Pathé was one of the film companies that he worked for.
Okay.
What was interesting about Pathé was that they actually hired him to direct films because they wanted more authentic Native subjects to be in Westerns.
Right. I'd heard that they'd gotten ridiculed for one that wasn't particularly accurate, and then tried to
absolutely
do a little
since
better
they were
job.
coming sort of from a European slant. They were definitely ridiculed in terms of that, and so they went the extra mile and hired a Native director, which was pretty unheard of.
Right.
To think that there was somebody that had that type of agency in that particular period of early cinema, who was Indian.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So he was an interesting character, and sort of played these very dualistic roles within what he was trying to show white audiences, and also what he was trying to show Native audiences. And his films were very interesting that way. His films were very dualistic. So.
Right. Well, hopefully we might be able to link to some of those. I think that we've still got some around for sure.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, well, jumping back forward in time then, back to what it is that you started developing then, as you maybe move from your theoretical development to an aesthetic development. What are you trying to do when you, or maybe you could talk to us about one of the films that you made then.
Right. When I started working at the University of Iowa as a grad student, working on my MFA, one of my mentors was Leighton Pierce, who's a pretty well-known experimental film artist, and he focused a lot on sound and very sort of visceral images of people, but it was interesting because you never really saw people's faces in his films. You never really, all the movement was very flow. It was just a completely different experience for me in terms of what I knew about cinema. I never even thought about experimental cinema in my life.
Yeah, right.
So when I walked into this situation of having a mentor that worked exclusively in that, it just influenced me immediately. And so I realized that you could take film in so many different directions to
doesn't have to
have
just
a
be the
message.
shot, reverse shot.
Doesn't
like
have to do. Yeah, it doesn't have to
yeah.
do. Yeah, you don't have to have the over the shoulders. You don't have to have necessarily everything in focus.
Good. I could be an experimental filmmaker
You could be an
myself.
experimental filmmaker. But I think what he really taught me was that, you know, you could sort of place narrative into these sort of beautiful, almost like paintings,
Okay.
and use sound
Yeah.
to its extent and sort of stretch things out, and it really made people think. And so aesthetically, that sort of grounded me, and I started to work in that medium, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's when I made Imikitic and started working on several other films. That there was another film called Effigies, where I looked at effigy mounds up in northern Iowa.